as we look at chapter 7 next week, I want to take a look at this question about binding and loosing. And let's start making our way to the book of Matthew. And we're going to begin at chapter 13, because I want to, chapter 16 rather, because I want to take care of the first part of this. And that would be where the Catholics would teach that that Jesus made Peter the first pope, and that there was the beginning of a priesthood that's implied here because of their ability to hold on to or to release man from sin. So the idea of binding and loosing sin. So again, the implication here is pretty straightforward, that the Catholics will tell you that this is a time when Peter is made the pope, and that he gives to him and to the disciples who were there that had traveled with Jesus the exclusive ability to determine whether or not a person could be forgiven or not forgiven of their sin, that would be something that rests completely in the power of the priest through confession to either absolve a person of sin, or if there's not the requisite penance and formula, if you will, then man can be forgiven. So they say that all of that was given here, and the implication would have to be that there is the beginning of, with Peter, a priesthood that starts with him as being the supreme, and then under him is others all the way down to priesthood who could hear the matters of men and then determine whether or not a man could or could not be forgiven of their sin. That would be something that is given to the priest. Interestingly enough, all of that is assumed because nothing in the New Testament gives us the details about God creating a church with a priesthood, with all the roles of priests and bishops and cardinals and popes and all that stuff. There's no how-to manual of a church structure that's anywhere near that. We do have one of those in the Old Testament sense when God created a priesthood, but there's no New Testament priesthood that's spoken of in any way. It's all, again, by implication. Interestingly enough, it is Peter in 1 Peter where we are told that Peter mentions about us being a royal priesthood, and the things that he has to say there. Interestingly enough, he speaks about Jesus as being that Petra that is mentioned here in chapter 16, that rock upon which the church is built. So even Peter, who they allege to be the very first pope, looks at Jesus as being the foundation of the church and not himself. So interesting that's the way that is. And really, if you think about it, most people would agree that it's Mark in his gospel that has Peter's input almost primarily as the authority, and Peter doesn't mention that, or Mark doesn't mention what Matthew records for us here. So this dialogue that Jesus has with Peter at Caesarea Philippi is only found here in Matthew. The other three Gospels don't even touch on it, and you would figure that if there was something like a priesthood and Peter being made the first vicar of Christ, the first pope, that would be something covered in all of the Gospels and really heavily spoken of in the epistles. And frankly, there should be a New Testament book that gives us the entire structure of a brand new priesthood with all of the offices and the functions and all the rest of that stuff. There should be a New Testament book that absolutely gives all of that description and detail, and yet it does not exist. We have to go to the Catholic Church, and they will tell us that this is what the structure is based upon their word, and not because God had given some instruction in his word about something as elaborate as the Catholic structure from the Pope on down to the laity. That's all stuff that we get from the church, so it's the Catholic Church that tells us, well, this is how it's supposed to be because we say so, not because there's a book in the Bible that gives the details like there was for the Old Testament. So if somebody said, well, I'm a priest, according to whom? Well, here's my genealogy. I'm actually a Levite, so I'm from the tribe of Levi, and if I'm serving in the temple, it's because I'm a direct descendant of Aaron. And here's all the functions that we're supposed to do, because the book of Leviticus gives us all of those details, and there's some additional things that we see when we look through Deuteronomy. So as far as that's concerned, the Old Testament priesthood and all of it in its just great detail, minutia of detail, we know all that stuff to be in place because God put it there, and it's written down for them, and we know it to be true. Well, in this case, we don't have any such thing in the New Testament sense. There's nothing that gives us that detail. But nonetheless, here's what we see. in verse 13 of Matthew 16, we get this. Now, when Jesus had come into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, Who do men say that I am, or that I, the Son of Man, am? And so they said, Well, some say John the Baptist, and some say Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. So he said to the disciples, Who do you then say that I am? Now it's Peter who steps up and says, Well, you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. Now here's the big question, is what does he mean by this? And is the foundation of the church a fallible man we call Peter, or is it upon the proclamation that Peter has made that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? What's better to build a church upon other than Jesus, the Christ of the living God? Because here's our two competitors in this possibility. If Jesus is going to create a church and found it on something as the basis for it, what would it be better than to say the church is founded upon Jesus, the Christ, the Son of the living God? Or is it better to build the church on Peter, a fallible man who didn't make it out of Caesarea Philippi without being called Satan? So get thee behind me, Satan. That happens a little bit later on in this chapter. That's what happens. Well, Jesus answered and he said to Peter, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah. And here's why. Because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. That's who revealed this truth to you. That you, Jesus, are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And here Jesus repeats that and says, You're blessed for knowing this, Peter, because flesh and blood you haven't figured this out on your own. Nobody told you this. God has revealed this to you. So it's not that Peter is different from all the rest. He's just the one who spoke up. Any of them could have been able to say, You're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God, and Jesus would have said the same thing to them. And I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So is Jesus then saying, You're Petros, but on this Petra, I'm going to change your name and who you are, and I'm going to make you the foundation stone of my church? Or is it more the proclamation that Peter made, which is the Christ, the Son of the living God? What's the better foundation for the church, Jesus or Peter? That's what it all boils down to. Peter would be the one who tells you that Jesus is the rock of offense that is spoken about in the book of Psalms, and he applies Jesus as being the Petra to being the head of the church in his own writings there in 1 Peter 2. But the Catholic Church believes differently and says that you're the Petros, or you're the Petra, Peter, and on this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound, and whatever you loose will be loosed. So that binding and loosing means that you're going to be the only ones who can forgive man of their sin, or you can retain it. And that's if they're not going to meet the requisite things that you, the priests, say to get right with God, then they're going to be held responsible, and you're going to be the one who binds that to them. So on an individual level, you will have the ability to forgive or not forgive sin. That's what they believe Jesus says that he gave to Peter, and then, of course, to the priesthood under him. That's what they believe. Well, interestingly enough, the same exact terms come up in chapter 18, binding and loosing. So here's where I can also address not only the Catholics, but also the deliverance ministry kind of people that talk about binding and loosing. And so that somehow we have this supernatural power to bind and loose. And so with the charismatics, the charismatics, the really over the top, talking about binding Satan and binding this and binding that, they seem to think that they have some kind of supernatural power to bind and loose. Once again, this, because we have chapter 18, we realize that both of them are completely wrong in this idea of binding and loosing, that supernaturally we've been given some kind of power to forgive or not forgive, or to bind things as having some supernatural power that we can take away the authority of. The way that the deliverance ministries people is, they'll say, well, we have the power to bind and loose because that's what we're told in Matthew 18. Okay, again, the whole idea of it is, man, if you're able to bind Satan, quote unquote, sure seems like that doesn't last very long, because he's right back to his old stuff minutes after you've bound him, and he's able to do everything else all over the place, if you really had the power to bind and loose, then, man, this stuff wouldn't be happening every single day where the devil's just running roughshod over everything. So, again, it's just such nonsense. But you take a verse here and a verse there and read stuff into it and then ascribe to yourself powers that you were never given. Look at what we see in verse 15. Moreover, if your brother sins against you and you go and tell him his fault between you and him alone, if he hears you, then you've gained a brother. So the issue here is the sinning of one person against another. So there's going to be the idea of the recognition that there's a problem between you and a brother, and you're going to have to confront this problem. Well, it says, but if he will not hear, then take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of two or three witnesses, every word will be established. That's taken from Deuteronomy 19:15. Bring witnesses with you the next time. If you go to him first and you confront him on the error and the sin that he's caused against you, and he refuses to hear and acknowledge it, take witnesses with you. And if that happens and the witnesses are basically refused, and if he refuses to hear them, then you tell it then to the church, the ecclesia, the gathering of the people. And again, there wasn't a church at this time because Jesus had not died and resurrected yet. So there's not a church in the church sense that's here. So interesting that if you're going to talk about this binding and loosing, because this is all said before, whether it's chapter 16 or chapter 18, this idea of binding and loosing is not something that the church was even in existence to be able to do. So here, this is the idea. But if he refuses even to hear the church, then let him be like a tax collector or a heathen. And so he says, assuredly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth, it will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth, it will be loosed in heaven. So the binding and the loosing, again, same terms that are used that he says among Peter, is the idea of the recognition that if there is a matter of sin and the recognition of it, and then the acknowledgement of it. And the person who has sinned, if a person will not come correct before God about their sin, then you can tell them you're responsible then, because you've neglected or you have rejected that God has made this aware to you. And so the fact that you've been confronted on this, you need to come to a recognition that you've been made accountable, and now you need to do something about it. So if you bring that to the attention of the person that you're confronting on this, they have to acknowledge that. And if they refuse to acknowledge that sin, then you're going to be able to say to them, then you're responsible before God. You can't be forgiven if you're going to reject what's been said to you. And in a larger sense, how then does that work as far as the church is concerned? If we go to people and we tell them that the Lord has sought to forgive them, but they refuse his offer of forgiveness and salvation, then they're going to be on their own. So that binding and loosing is just simply the recognition that a person is responsible before God for their sin. And if they won't take the option of forgiveness, then they're going to have to deal with the consequences. They'll answer to God for their unwillingness to repent and to turn from that sinfulness. On the other hand, if they hear the message and hear what you have to say, and they come to the place of seeking God for his forgiveness, then you can tell them you're forgiven. You've taken God's remedy that he's offered to you. But this binding and loosing is the exact same Greek words in chapter 16 and 18, and it would mean the same thing. That if we're able to know how it is that man can be made right before God when sin is the issue, they need to regard and to acknowledge that sin and be cleansed from it by acknowledging their guilt and then seeking remedy. If it's person to person and you point them out, you've sinned against me and you've done this wrong, let them come to the place of saying, sorry for what I've done against you. I acknowledge that and seek your forgiveness. That's person to person. It also works in the opposite, or in the other way of saying, in the perfect sense, if man has sinned against God and you make that person aware of it, they can be made right before God if you will tell them the circumstances. And really the best way of putting it is that God's terms of what is forgiveness. Let's explain to them what sin is and that God has given terms of how to be reconciled to him. And if man will accept those terms, we can say, look, you're right before God. You've made that right before him. You've explained to them the terms and they've accepted. But if not, they're going to be responsible, and you can tell a person, look, if you're going to try and say, I'll stand before God on my own goodness, and I think that God forgives people because they do good things, okay, you can believe that all you want to, but when you stand before God, you're not going to be forgiven. It's Jesus who's able to forgive you of your sin because he's paid for the price of that sin in his own blood. If you think you'll stand before him good in your own efforts and everything else, then he died with no good cause. So binding and loosing. It isn't about wielding some kind of spiritual authority. And it's not in the sense of, kind of casting down demons and all the rest of that. That's not what's being spoken of as binding and loosing. It's also not telling you that there's some brand new priesthood that only they have the ability to forgive or not forgive sins. It is left to the individual. Because again, if this in chapter 18 is speaking to the priesthood, then why would the priesthood, if they have the power to forgive sins, why would they need to seek out witnesses? Why would they need to seek out ultimately the church if that's the case? They're the authority. Why would those people who are somehow the authority, why would they have to go seek another authority above them? The Catholic Church tells me they are the authority. Why would they have to go to somebody outside of themselves? So it's the offices that are getting mixed up in the minds of many here. So if you have any questions on any of those things, please contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, and I'd love to be able to answer any follow-up questions you might have to any of the things I shared today. And I pray that you would be blessed as you continue to study through God's Word.